the Reagan era is garbage. The Roosevelt era, like, not only are the poorer people or the majority of people in the United States doing better, like the U.S. economy is doing better, dramatically better during the New Deal era than it is under the Reagan era. The only difference is that the Reagan era is that you can get fabulously wealthy. So the rich do much, much better under the Reagan era than they do under the FDR era.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of everything else is Robert Morris. How is your Christmas gone?
Oh, it's gone. It's been lovely. It's been quite a great time. We had just family. My family tends to prioritize Thanksgiving, which is a huge production in the United States. We do it at the end of November, and my family does Thanksgiving to an extreme that very few others indulge in. Christmas is phenomenal because we just do nothing. We just sort of sit
it's
around.
quite relaxed.
Oh yeah, sit around with just the mom, dad, and my siblings. Kick back, go see a movie, that sort of thing. So really delightful and relaxing.
Wonderful. Since you've had such a lovely, wonderful time, is there anything cheery you'd like to tell us all over the Christmas period?
Well, yeah, we figured because it's the holiday season, we go with a light, easy topic. So we're going with economic collapse. For this
Wow.
episode and the next, we'll be discussing historic financial calamity. And in the next, quite possibly, depending on how you look at it, either current financial calamity or impending financial calamity. So today, we're going to talk about the Great Depression.
Because everyone is in the red after Christmas.
Indeed. Well, and honestly, Rory, I mean, talking about stuff like this compared to our usual nightmare of genocide, country collapse, and
Starvation.
yeah, this is light and breezy.
Well, if something terrible happened a long time ago or something that's terrible that might happen in the future, so it's a nice place to be.
Yeah, it is actually lighter fare by our standards, Rory, and I think it's our holiday approach, starting the new year off. But it's also fascinating stuff to look into, and the Great Depression, specifically as a historic event, is still incredibly controversial in the United States.
Yeah, that's what I didn't realize looking this up. Everyone's arguing when did it actually end and what caused it. And he was terrible and it was all World War II saved it. So yeah, it's weird that there's still so much division over this subject.
Well, because it's such an important question. It's at the heart of what the Biden administration was talking about, the way that the Biden administration formulated its disputes with the Trump administration. It's at the heart of what the Trump administration may or may not want to do. It's at the heart of battles in between the Trump administration. It is fundamentally what the Great Depression and the New Deal that the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came up with to deal with it are about, is the nature and the role of government in the economy, in society, in guiding the country. And that means that the Great Depression, this economic collapse from the late 1920s until the early 1940s or late 1930s, depending again how you measure it.
Yes.
It's controversial. Is a continuously fresh topic, and I think that's why it's important that we're going to dive in on this question, and I think we're going to address a couple of the biggest myths, so really just two really big myths about the Great Depression that I think are worth combating. I mean, honestly, like misconceptions about the Great Depression that I held, quite frankly, as well as most everyone else in the country, were kind of key to Obama's mismanagement of the Great Recession. That naming choice is an intentional echo. Or another way to describe it is the jobless recovery after the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of the reason why Barack Obama was not as ambitious in the aftermath of that crisis as he was is because of misconceptions about the Great Depression that were consciously reinforced during that period of time. And really, it's amusingly enough, it's actually Donald Trump that finally followed up on the lessons of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, finally did actually make the expenditures that were necessary to get the United States out of the Great Recession. Essentially, I'm saying it's just a really, really live issue. It is a thing that's
I
going
know
on.
FDR in particular is hated by a lot of incredibly wealthy individuals because they like to think they know everything, and this horrible man came in and put in all these regulations, and things would have been better off without him.
Yeah, and it's fascinating the way that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, people on the right wing, and not just on the right wing, were able to go back to the critique of Herbert Hoover and sort of the uber wealthy of the 1930s, and really just use exactly their talking points and exactly their arguments and put them forward in nominally respectable publications in the United States. And I was a part of the reading public who just sort of nodded and swallowed these ideas. And they were very bad for the country and provided an incredible opening to Donald Trump, both in the sense that Obama's failure to fix the U.S. economy left it open to Trump to come in and do the spending that was necessary to improve things. But also, yeah, just this incredible opportunity that Trump was given. Um,
But did Trump not do only do a lot of that because of the pandemic?
He did on an extreme level, because of the pandemic, but from the second he got into power, all of the restraints that had been placed on Obama for his spending were gone.
Okay.
Things got much, much, much better. COVID was incredibly distorting, but even from 2017, from the moment that Donald Trump got into power, he was spending more. The Republicans in Congress would let him spend more than Obama, and it was effective. That's what got poorest Americans to see a real, increase in their living standards. It's easy to confuse the two because,
Hmm.
yes, of course, in 2017, we instantly went back to trillion-dollar deficits, which Obama had not been allowed to have by the Republican Congress and by the ideological climate that we're going to talk about in this episode. And in 2020, we had a $3 or $4 trillion deficit. We're gonna talk a lot about over these next two episodes. We're gonna talk a lot about like $1 trillion estimates. But usually, when we're talking about $1 trillion estimates, you're talking about something like the net, international investment profile of the entire United States, or like U.S. GDP or something like that. No, in a single year, the US government spending, I think, $2 or $3 trillion more than it took in is like an insanity. But Trump was already spending at a much, much higher clip, which actually ended up working out pretty well for the economy. So I guess what is the Great Depression? Like, is probably a good place to start.
But everything was going well in the 20s, Rob. What's there to worry about?
That is not actually the case. But I think there's two myths that I want to sort of demolish in this episode. The first is the myth of the New Deal didn't work. I think that's just clearly nonsense, and is based on misinterpreting a few real pieces of data and just sort of outright lying about what happened. And then another myth, which is sort of a broader myth that isn't so the New Deal didn't work is very rooted in our current sort of Reagan era approach to things, sort of the past 45 years. But the other myth is this myth of like U.S. isolationism, this idea that the United States somehow wasn't already at the center of everything as early as 1917, and this idea that the United States spent all the time between World War I and World War II just having nothing to do with the world and being isolationist, and we weren't a part of anything. And that is not actually like true at all. So the Great Depression, as I think any student of history, at least in the United States, knows, and I'd love to hear like just how this is talked about in Northern Ireland as well. But it's just, in there was a stock market crash in October of 1929, and then the next 10 years of economic life in the United States were horrifically hard and bad. It is rightly seen as like a central part of the drama of the 20th century in the United States. We talk about the greatest generation, the generation that won World War II. But what makes them the greatest generation is not only did they win World War II, they grew up during the Great Depression, so they had to deal with the Depression and then World War, and then they crafted this incredible post-war prosperity of the 1950s. So like it's just part of the U.S. story. And I think what might have been the case in my parents' generation is that part of that story would have emphasized the successes and the impressive nature of the New Deal policies that FDR put in place to combat the Great Depression. But in my childhood, early adulthood, the emphasis has mostly been on the New Deal didn't really work. New Deal actually wasn't that useful. It's really only World War II that brought us out of the Great Depression. All that stuff that FDR was doing was kind of a waste of time. And I think that's sort of like the general perception of the Great Depression in the United States. I mean, with interesting holdovers, like still like John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath is, a classic film that is rooted in a much more left-leaning view of things, a much more FDR-friendly view of things. I mean, there's an underlayer to U.S. culture that appreciates the New Deal, that appreciates what Roosevelt did, that focuses on the incredible tragedy and economic deprivation of the Great Depression and how important it was that things were done to try to alleviate this. But that's like sort of a sublayer. Most of the stuff that we've been swimming in the United States for the past 40 years is sort of like FDR. It's nice. It's nice that he beat Hitler, but that whole New Deal thing was kind of silly. Of course, because during most of my adult life, both the Republican and Democratic parties have been making themselves busy dismantling as much of the New Deal as they can. It's sort of interesting. That's sort of, I think, the baseline where we'll start
Mhm.
off with the Great Depression. But how is it viewed in Ireland? Like, how's it thought
Well,
about? How's it
the
talked
thing
about?
is, cause it's quite near the birth of Ireland. Like Northern Ireland's what started in 1921. So weirdly, I think a lot of that period is generally talking about Ireland getting started, Northern Ireland being invented, things to that. So the Depression isn't really brought up. Ireland's weirdly kind of got a wee bit of money early on, but De Valera kind of does a bit of an Argentina and stuff, which they kind of tried to out Republican the IRA. So I think a lot of this period is caught up in the birth of the state and not so much, oh, the Depression caused XYZ, if you know what I mean.
And I suppose both Ireland and Northern Ireland were sort of mired in were much poorer countries than they
Yeah, but I
are
think
today.
definitely compared to today. But I think historically Northern Ireland, at that period would have been much better off than the Republic because I think the Republic doesn't have a lot of its historical buildings. I think it was neglected because it was just so poor, while Northern Ireland seems to still have more of them in comparison. But definitely at this period, a lot of them, a lot of people aren't emigrating here. They're leaving.
Because I just one of the interesting things about the Great Depression, if we were to contemplate another sort of depression type
Hmm.
thing, were that to happen again, it would actually have much broader impact on everybody in the world because everybody in the world is so much more connected
Oh yeah,
to world
absolutely.
financial systems than they used to be. And I was kind of wondering if I think it definitely is the case for Ireland. It's probably a different issue for Northern Ireland, but I think that to the extent that Ireland was still so rural, still so like just people weren't as connected to international financial flows as say the United Kingdom was, or France was, or certainly the United States was. So it was almost like you got hit harder by the Great Depression if you were living at in a more industrial.
But it would also have meant that just as Ireland was starting off, it kind of kneecapped it essentially. It really made things difficult when it could have maybe started to flourish.
And of course, people who are primarily agricultural are probably trying to sell.
Yeah, I think historically this was Ireland's bread and biscuits phase. It was a big company, Jacobs and also Guinness, would have been two of the largest employers. So it wasn't, the most dynamic economy. So it obviously then, if it wasn't really if people were struggling to pay, these things wouldn't have sold great.
So it's interesting. So I guess, but generally, it seems like for Ireland, it's more like the drama of independence and establishment of the republic than. Whereas the Great Depression still has a huge, huge footprint in the minds of people in the United States who study history, which is kind of extraordinary and is an indicator of just how like terrible it was. So to start sort of on this sort of demolishing of the first myth of U.S. isolationism, the great I was sort of weirded me out, like, why would a stock market crash in the United States have this incredible ballooning worldwide impact?
Black Tuesday.
Yeah, the most famous, worldwide impact of the stock market crash of the United States or the Great Depression more broadly would, of course, be Adolf Hitler. The fall of Germany into Nazism is, I believe, is 1933 that Hitler came to power. I could be wrong about that, but that was after 4 or 5 years of depression. This is worldwide depression. And it always kind of confused me, just the way that the history of this era is told at the basic level, like sort of in the high schools. It's like, so why would a stock market crash in the United States lead to this just extraordinary worldwide destruction where everything gets screwed up? What I've been learning as I have been writing this book, American Empire, the First 100 Years, I'm going decade by decade, is just learning that after World War I, the world financial system was entirely dependent on the United States. It's just this extraordinary, kind of ridiculous dynamic, frankly. So after World War I, Germany was completely on its knees economically and had been forced to pay these massive, massive reparations to the Allied powers, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, and Italy to some extent. There were people in Britain who recognized that these reparations were unjust, were going to keep the entire European economy from recovering. But the problem was the British had to pay back these massive, massive debts to the United States. This became incredibly, really seriously problematic to the extent that even the United States was like, oh, this is a real problem in the early 1920s, where Germany was like, oh, we got to pay all these debts? Well, cool, we'll just inflate the currency into nothingness, and created this sort of massive, massive financial crisis. Made it clear to the United States, it's like, well, we've got to keep Europe going to some extent if we want to sell anything to anybody. And we also really, 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 really don't want Europe to go the way that that Russia went and become communist. So what we started doing in the early 1920s with it, which I can't remember if it was the Dawes or the Young Plan, was we basically started loaning Germany large amounts of money that was then paid to France and Britain as reparations, which then that money was just sent directly back to the United States. So it was this great system where we would loan money that was mostly used to pay us back. And it's just this kind of extraordinary example of
It nearly reminds me of what happens with Saudi Arabia, where America's buying oil or whatever, and then that investment then goes straight back to America to fund the stock market and a lot of these tech companies.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think it was hard for. It's interesting because I'm just looking at this conflict in the history. It's like it was this absurd situation that Europe was in, and I think to some degree deeply unjust. But what the Americans would say at that point, and I actually have some sympathy to, is like, well, hey, like you decided to do this war that you couldn't pay for, and it was a choice that Britain and the other countries made. And it is really at no point since the 1920s has the United States been this sort of unequivocally dominant on every metric. After World War II, the United States essentially sort of initiated a bit of a sort of a welfare system for the world, where we started sort of beginning to acknowledge, like, okay, we'll have these large trade deficits to get Germany and Japan and Western Europe back on its feet after these wars, and well, because our economy is so amazing and so much better that we can just have big trade deficits. We can do Marshall Plans, this, that, and the other thing. In the 1920s, it really was this absurd situation where not only was the United States making all of this money off of loaning money that was then paid back to the United States primarily. Also, the United States was the industrial behemoth that had a big trade surplus and I think a current account surplus. So it was this crazy thing where we were only balancing world finances by loaning people money to get further in hock to the United States. So it was just from the US perspective, this is incredibly virtuous cycle, and everyone in Europe was super, super dependent on the United States. And I think that's the missing piece here. This is why a stock market crash in the United States was so bad for Europe and the rest of the world. But actually started kind of earlier. Like World War
Wasn't there one that happened, yeah, slightly earlier, as you said, and then it went back up, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's not going to happen again," and then it did.
Well, that's sort of the story of after the stock market crash. There's all kinds of like, there was one really bad day, and then it was a bad week, and then things sort of creeped up a bit, and then
I think they
and
call it a dead cat bounce.
yes, a dead cat bounce, yes. But even before, this is kind of interesting. Like World War II has a lot of different beginnings depending on how you want to measure it. I think most people now, it's sort of the more, I don't want to use the word woke, but the more generally accepted way of looking is no, no, no. World War II didn't start in 1939. It started in 1937 when Japan invaded China or
Yeah, yeah,
something along
yeah.
those lines. Or, of course, from the US perspective, World War II didn't really start until Pearl Harbor in 1941. Whereas Europe, it's 1939 when Germany, goes to war with France and the UK, and then China's invasion of Japan, 1937. So really, the Great Depression starts in the United States in 1929. There are broader questions that the United States was in a agricultural recession, I think across most of the 1920s, which is, of course, worth mentioning, but just in a broader perspective, the weird thing is, and this is a dynamic that we saw in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s with the Volcker shock, and I think we're actually honestly kind of seeing right now, but this is the first example of that. Decisions that the United States took to deal with its out of control stock market before the crash actually, I would kind of argue, started the depression
Wow.
in Europe a year and a half earlier than it started in the United States.
Is it just because there's less funds going? The smallest correction has had a massive effect.
So the 1920s are known as the Roaring Twenties.
Hmm.
It wasn't just the stock market. There was a famous Florida real estate boom and bust,
Okay.
actually, even
Is this
before
back when like Cuba was at its height?
I mean, Cuba at this point was a, semi protectorate of the United States. I would say like I don't know, that what
But is this like when it's full of casinos and all
I'm
sorts?
sure I think it did at that point. Well, I more associate that like sort of go-go Havana with the 1950s right before the
Okay.
crash, but I don't know. But Florida itself, even before air conditioning, became a huge, huge boom and bust thing in the 1920s. A lot more things going on here than we can discuss today. Agricultural depression, Florida boom and bust. But the stock market is sort of the iconic indication of why the 20s were roaring economically in the United States. But as we see, as we saw in 2005, 6, 7 in the United States, people could see before the crash, like before the real estate crash in 2008 in the United States, but people could see across the late 1920s at least that the US stock market was out of control. Like that it was none of this stuff was worth what it was being, and more and more people who knew less and less were piling in. So this is why it's like the Volcker shock in the late 1970s, early 1980s, or what Jerome Powell has been doing at the Federal Reserve in the 2020s, is that U.S. economic problem prompts the U.S. central bank to make a decision to deal with the U.S. economic problem that has incredibly wide ramifications. So I just described that system where the German economy is kept afloat by U.S. loans so it can pay money to France and Britain, so France and Britain can pay money to the United States. That's the system that existed. That was like the underpinning of the European and world financial system in the 1920s, and that depended very crucially on how much money cost to borrow from the United States. Because if all of a sudden you go from being able to have, I don't know what the actual, 2% loans from the United States at the first start of that, for the German thing, to all of a sudden it's 5% loans or 7% loans, or maybe just that money's not available at all, then the whole thing breaks, or at least starts to break. And that's what started happening in June of 1928, almost a year and a half before the October 1929 crash, because the United States wanted to calm down its own economy and make less money available for speculation on the US stock markets. They tried to slow things down, didn't really manage to do it before a cataclysmic crash in the fall of 1929, but what they did do was slow down the world economy. So even before, drastically bad things that the US government did, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, the US economy was already creating the beginnings of the Great Depression, or an economic downturn at least, before the 1929 stock market
Do you
crash.
think if they hadn't implemented these regulations that it would have happened eventually but been much worse? Or is it all because of these regulations?
Well, it's not, I think it's not regulations. It is essentially the Federal Reserve and a few other levers of the US government essentially saying we're just going to make less money available for debts. We're going to charge higher interest rates for that. That's a really complicated question, really. I think that the people in the 1920s who wanted to make money harder to get to slow down this speculation on the stock market were correct that there was eventually going to be a catastrophic failure. And it was probably good to send these signals. And there are probably a lot of people who were able to get out of the stock market, or make the appropriate choice, or maybe even it prolonged the period of the Roaring Twenties by keeping the crash from happening. But there are a lot of other things going on in the US stock market, specifically practices that I would call corrupt and immoral, that the New Deal did eventually work to make illegal. It wasn't just that people were going crazy with a speculative mania in the 1920s. It's that a lot of stuff was going on, like insider trading, like just flatly fraudulent. I mean, it's extraordinary. I read this book just recently called Taming the Street by Diana Henriquez, which I would absolutely highly, highly recommend. It's just one aspect of the New Deal, but was like the financial regulation that was undertaken. And it is gobsmacking just how insanely corrupt and just monstrously fraudulent the stock market's running was. And like the guy who's in charge of the New York Stock Exchange in the 1920s and 1930s was a straight up embezzler. Like he was just straight up. He was the most, and he was like on the cover of Time magazine. He was apparently played an important role in the early days of the stock market
So it
crash. And
makes what corruption goes on now look like a small amount.
So like the face of like I mean, there was a Federal Reserve chairman back then, but probably like the most famous, calm hand on the tiller who kept the stock market from really going crazy, whatever, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, kept the exchanges open, was the responsible for like sort of the Alan Greenspan of or the Jerome Powell of that era, was straight up stealing from all of his clients, and was like,
Classic.
yeah, I mean, it's just like just absurd obscenity that I just never really knew about. Like it wasn't something that I was aware of because I was raised in this conservative tradition. Oh, the New Deal was really, actually, the New Deal made the Depression last longer.
Well, yeah, that's what I've heard. It was like, oh, it would have ended 10 years sooner if it wasn't for FDR.
Which is absolutely insane, and it's like so profoundly unscientific because we actually have a really good indicator of what would happen without FDR and without the New Deal policies. This is a key thing that you have to ignore to make the standard US case that, oh, the New Deal didn't matter. The New Deal is just this silly thing that wasn't. You have to ignore the fact that the Great Depression started in 1929 and FDR wasn't president until 1933. So to make this case, you've got to pretend that, like, well, Herbert Hoover had mostly whipped the Great Depression. Like the things were mostly handled by 1932, 1933, 1933, the year that Hitler came to power. Things were mostly handled by then, or what have you. Because FDR is elected in the fall of 1932 and doesn't come to power because yeah, even you had an even longer lame duck period until I think March of 1933. And that's just not true. Like, we had the laissez-faire, the government shouldn't do anything, depressions are natural and normal. Actually, what we should do is spend less
And would have
money.
that
And
been like significantly laissez-faire, even compared to what someone would consider to be laissez-faire in today's world?
well,
Like when you
well,
talk about the corruption that went on, it just seemed to be in a whole league of its own. Like when you're letting the markets do what they want, are you really like completely off the rails?
Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the regulator of U.S. financial markets, did not exist until Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Hmm.
Like there was no regulation. Like it
Wow.
was, oh, let the market. So what the main governing institution of the New York Stock Exchange up until the Securities and Exchange Commission was the New York Stock Exchange, headed by this guy, Dick Whitney, who was the guy that I was talking about, who was stealing from everybody, stealing from all of his own clients, borrowing money from all of the wealthiest and most sophisticated bankers in New York and just not paying it back for a decade. Like that's the guy who was in charge of regulating. So there just wasn't any regulation of securities markets at all. And even if there was nothing else that the New Deal did, the fact that they introduced the basics of regulating financial markets, pretty huge accomplishment that we saw. I mean, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, we discussed on this podcast a year or two back the failure of some banks in the United States. They had some big crypto accounts. Silicon Valley Bank, yes, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in
Hmm.
New York were not systemic problems that caused like the whole house of cards to fall over because of an institution called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is also a New Deal reform. Like so much of the basics of how world finance and the U.S. government functions are things that FDR brought in. And Herbert Hoover didn't do any of that. And Herbert Hoover provided what the sort of New Deal didn't work propagandists say should have been done. And by the time Herbert Hoover handed over power to FDR, like banks were failing. Like the entire US banking system almost failed. Some of this has to do with the conflict between Hoover and FDR. Like it was this weird thing where like FDR had won on a promise of being regulating finance and bringing big changes to the way things were run. And Herbert Hoover was like holding the government to ransom and was not making basic reforms because he wanted to make FDR promise he wouldn't do anything that he ran on beforehand. Yeah, so yeah, like it's insane if you actually know any of the history of the Great Depression and what actually happened, that like intelligent people are arguing, or respectable people are arguing in U.S. publications that, oh, the New Deal didn't work and actually Herbert Hoover had it right. Like it's shocking just reading this like the entire U.S. banking system had to be closed for a couple weeks in 1933.
Wow.
That's where we got after 4 years of like, let the markets sort it all out stuff. Another key thing is the bonus marchers in 1932. Essentially, a whole like I think the tens of thousands of U.S. veterans marched on the Capitol of Washington, D.C. to argue that they should get a sort of a prepayment on some pensions or whatnot.
Yeah.
And there was a battle
Yeah.
between the U.S. military and U.S. veterans in the streets
With
of
Smedley Butler.
Washington, D.C. Yes, Smedley Butler helped clear the camps under Douglas. No, actually, no, Smedley Butler, I think, might have been speaking to the marchers.
Yeah, I think he was pro veterans.
Yeah, I think he was out by that point. But Douglas MacArthur, who famously became a great American hero during World War II, led the forces clearing the camps. Like there were battles basically in Washington D.C. That's what laissez-faire. That's what letting the markets work led to. 1932, you had battles in the streets of Washington D.C. Battles overstates it. It was, the bonus marches weren't heavily armed, but they were violently cleared and their tent encampments were burned, and they were driven out of the city by tanks under Douglas MacArthur. And in 1933, the spring of 1933, the entire U.S. banking system was failing. FDR came to power and fixed most of these things and put in things like the Securities Exchange Commission, the Social Security, just all these basics of
Are these like fundamental things people just consider as like generic American infrastructure now? Is all
yeah.
because of him?
Yeah. There was this amazing quote in this Diana Henriquez book where she was having an argument on Twitter with some guy who's like, "We don't need the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm a knowledgeable investor. I can just go read the quarterly reports of these companies. I don't need some government agency telling us what we can do." And she's just sort of like, "Well, why do you think there are quarterly 10K reports from these companies?" It's because it's a requirement of the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is the water we swim in. And to my embarrassment, when I was following all the controversies around the 2008 financial crisis and what Obama was going to do, and there's the parable of the old fish goes to the young fish, goes, "Oh, what do you think of the water today?" And the young fish goes, "What's
What's water?
water?" Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's I don't,
Because it's been around so long, you don't notice it as a thing.
or you just don't know enough. And I think I just didn't know enough. I just didn't understand specifically the 2008, 2009 financial battles. Absolutely, financial regulation was a key part of that. But fundamentally, the thing that Obama got wrong and then Trump got right is one of the things that Herbert Hoover got wrong and FDR got right, which was spending a
Hmm.
lot of money. Part of the reason, this is kind of interesting, is the reason why one of the great arguments against what FDR did was the fact that in 1937 there was a sort of renewed mini depression. There was a recession. There was a massive recession 4 years into his time in power. And it's like, oh, if the New Deal worked, why did this happen? Well, the reason it happened was because after 4 years, FDR was like, okay, we've gotten economic recovery. Unemployment is down. Things are looking up. He was still a man of the 20th. He was a man of the 19th century, and was like, well, now it's time to balance the budget. Now it's time to stop spending money, and that's where you got the Roosevelt recession, 1937. So and that's also so the other big thing that people point to is that unemployment did not recover to the 1929 figure until I think 1942 due to World War II and economic growth and all these things. But that's not really an argument against the central point here, which is yeah, the reason that World War II brought the United States out of depression is because the US government was spending a lot of money.
Do you think America would have been in a position to, be the manufacturing superpower of World War II if it wasn't for FDR?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it gets one of there's this book Cadillac Desert, which talks about water management in the West, and talks about how some of the New Deal programs around building dams and whatnot looked just ridiculous. Like the projection. I'm paraphrasing this. I'm not. This isn't entirely accurate. Go read Cadillac Desert. It's a great book. But the projections in the 1930s was that the Hoover Dam, ironically, but these dams that had been built out in California, out west, had created a supply of electricity that couldn't possibly be utilized until the 1990s or something like that. It was like for 50 years, it was just absurd government excess, ridiculous. And then, of course, it was all used to capacity by 1944
Wow.
to create the aircraft carriers and the fighter jets that defeated Japan. And it is kind of fascinating. And people estimate that without those energy projects, without those hydropower projects that FDR had helped. I think it overstates to say FDR had done this. I mean, because what happens during the New Deal is like FDR provides this space for all kinds of things that might have been happening already to happen at a faster pace, or what have you, the reclamation board or something like that. But I think there's an estimate in that book, Cadillac Desert, that without FDR's power projects out west, perhaps World War II would have taken until 1947 or 1948. Might have lasted 3 or 4 years longer. And can you imagine
Yeah.
how horrific that would have been? Yeah, so I think there's certainly something to be said for that. I want to be cautious about making that broader argument, but in that one instance, that's certainly an example here. And I think people who are like, "Well, New Deal was BS because he didn't instantly bring the economy back to where it was in 1929," or like, you're just not reckoning with this scale of catastrophe we're talking about here, like worldwide. Like the fact that FDR managed to bring back a modicum of hope and basic functioning, because after 4 years, and poor Herbert Hoover, who was, actually, the more I read about how Herbert Hoover handled being president between 1929 and 1933, the less sympathy I have for him. But he was like the darling of. He was actually seen as sort of a progressive figure, and wanted to manage things. And it doesn't seem like he was as personally corrupt as most of the people on Wall Street. But he was this darling through the 1920s of good government, and was a prominent figure in both the Coolidge and the Harding administrations, and was seen as somewhat heroic in actions that he had led around World War I think feeding Belgium, feeding a variety of places. And then he basically becomes president in 1929. In March of 1929, 6 months later, stock market crashes, and he just becomes a avatar of incredible failure. But that's Herbert Hoover for you.
Do you see a great distribution of wealth with Roosevelt? Because it seems like when you hear like the stock market's doing well, it doesn't necessarily mean people are doing well in reality. Like whoever's in these certain amount of stocks doing all this insider trading are doing well. But it seemed like after World War II, we're getting a lot more, jobs for normal people. There's a massive boom. Is this mostly down to him?
Oh, I wouldn't say no. Let's not give FDR too much credit. The As far as like the dramatic reduction in inequality, actually, sometimes market crashes can be pretty good for that, and I think that that's actually a distinction between what happened in the 1930s and what happened in 2008. In 2008 and in 2020, the focus of government and what government was able to do was to largely preserve the fortunes of the wealthy.
Yeah,
That was the main
bail
priority.
out the banks.
What I think makes people very angry about the New Deal is that it took the U.S. economy more broadly bounce back from the stock market crash in 1929, the Great Depression. By the early 1940s and the 1950s, you had these incredible 1950s, 1960s, this incredible boom in the United States where everybody did well. The U.S. stock market didn't really recover from. I think it probably hit the actual number at some point in like the 1950s, 1960s, but it did not recover the vigor and the wealth creation possibilities that it had in the 1920s until the 1970s. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because that's seen as like this incredible mark against the New Deal or whatnot. In fact, the most prominent book talking about how bad the New Deal was just focuses on how the stock market performed. Because if that's your indicator, then yeah, of course, it's terrible, it's evil. But you'd have to ignore the fact that like the 1940s, 50s, 60s were like this incredible time of widespread prosperity and wealth. The dirty secret that just never gets covered, and I should probably do a video on this, is that but for economic growth statistics and all of these sort of Republican anti-tax organizations are all about growth, the club for growth. We want
Mhm.
economic growth. Comparing the economic growth of the Reagan era to the FDR era, say sort of 1930s to 1970s versus 1980s to today, it's the Reagan era is garbage. Like the Roosevelt era, like the not only is like are the poorer people or the majority of people in the United States doing better, like the US economy is doing better, dramatically better during the New Deal era than it is under the Reagan era. The only difference is at the Reagan era is that you can get fabulously wealthy. So the rich do much, much better under the Reagan era than they do under the FDR era. It's interesting between like the 1930s and like the 1970s. There's some exceptions, like I think like new oil magnates rise or what have you. But like the richest people in the United States in like the 50s, 60s, 70s are the same families that were the richest people in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. Like it's all still Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and Astors and what have you, because there just weren't that many opportunities to get. You could become wealthy, of course. You could become a high flying executive that made 25 times as much as the people working on the factory line. And there were luxuries. There was a luxury industry. You could become rich, but like there was not like the entire class of CEOs making 250 times as much as the
Mm.
factory line
Yeah.
worker, or the fact that if you just had played your cards right, if you just bought Apple stock in the 1980s, you could never, you and your kids never had to work again. That's not a world that existed under the New Deal. I'm not entirely certain that's such a bad thing.
What lessons do you think we can learn about FDR and the New Deal that you're worried that a certain Donald Trump may throw a lot of these regulation in the bin and bring us back to the 1920s in a bad way?
Oh, well, yeah, yeah, well, the 1920s was pretty bad. It was a period where some of the wealthy were doing extraordinarily well. And it was also a period where, I mean, similar to our own day, it was a period where a lot of new products were coming online. Of course, in our day, it's mostly social media and AI, as opposed to in the 1920s, where it was automobiles and washing machines and stuff like that.
And records?
Yes, the things like that. The parallels it's an interesting question because like the parallels are immense. I wouldn't go so far to say like the parallels are exact, but it is this same conversation that we're having. And it's not just it's a question within both the Trump and the Biden administrations. That's a key thing here is that Obama, or at least Obama's economic advisors, were largely convinced by this argument that they needed to be really worried about government spending, and they really didn't want to intervene too much in the economy of the 2008 financial crisis in ways that I think Trump has honestly grown beyond Obama in a lot of ways. And this is part of the contrast between Trump and Musk and his other sort of Silicon Valley plutocrats, is that Trump made it very clear he has no interest in attacking Medicare. He has no interest in attacking Social Security. But, Vivek and Elon Musk and Doge or whatever definitely want to talk about both of those things. The Heritage Foundation definitely wants to talk about those things with Project 2025. So, yeah, it is a really interesting question. The extent to which that battle is going to play out in the Trump administration, how that's going to play out in the Trump administration is, I think, just as fascinating as how it played out in the Biden administration, because that tension was certainly very present. This is a key part of the ideology that we all swim in of pro-market fundamentalism. This idea that the way they did things in the 1920s was the right way to do
Mhm.
things. I think probably the most on point, like almost on point to the point of
Satire?
parody. Yeah, satire, parody, exactly, is cryptocurrency market
Mhm.
regulation. The cryptocurrencies are the whole point of these cryptocurrencies. They're sort of is to get around the New Deal, is to get around the Securities and Exchange Commission, is to find ways to do financial manipulation and it functions like in crypto. insider trading is legal. In crypto, market manipulation isn't just legal, like it's like just what you do, and that's very much the 1920s. That's what they call them investment pools.
Hmm.
And this wasn't something that was done openly because you couldn't do it too openly, but it was in like an openly acknowledged, not illegal practice for groups of rich people in New York to manipulate the prices of stocks to make them go up and then to do a rug pull, I guess they call it now, and then all at once, when it got to a high point, leave the basic investors holding the bag. That's a practice. Like it's fascinating how the entire crypto ecosystem that's supposedly so anti-government or this, that, and the other thing is exactly replicating 1920s stock
Hmm.
scams,
Yep.
and now also the insistence that the government bail them out because Herbert Hoover did finally.
Capitalist when it suits you.
Yeah, Herbert Hoover did finally, by the end, way too late, by the end of his administration, do something about the Great Depression, which is he started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was eventually expanded and remolded by FDR. But what that did was basically give loans to the businesses that had defrauded the public to keep them afloat. And it's not necessarily like, something that shouldn't have happened. You need to have businesses to keep the economy afloat. But it was Herbert Hoover, was acting to save the companies that had defrauded the public and brought about this market crash. And that's exactly what the crypto folks are sort of asking for now, which is, we don't want any kind of regulation. How dare you shut down innovation by asking us to have any kind of responsibilities like every other kind of investment class since the 1930s? How dare you ask us for any of that? But we'd like you to facilitate, this regulated system dumping money into our system.
I don't want any laws for what car I can drive or how fast I can drive or where I can drive. But if I crash, I want you to pay for the insurance.
Essentially, yes. Yeah, no, that's pretty much the crypto market right now. And that is the insane Wall Street folks who brought us the Great Depression. But we like, as with 2008, there are it is absolutely insane greed and corruption of Wall Street that brought us there, but it is also government missteps. It is also this obsession with balanced budgets, this obsession with, oh, well, oh, the economy's crashing, maybe we should raise interest rates. Something else that was going on here that we don't have the time to get into was that the Hoover administration, as well as the governments of France and Britain, were also during this period where the Great Depression was getting worse and worse between 1929 and 1933 when Roosevelt came in, they were also trying to maintain the gold standard at the same time. So you had this ridiculous period where like the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates during this insane depression and deflation. So yeah, there was a lot going on with the New Deal, but I hope we've at least chipped away a little at this idea that the New Deal didn't do anything or New Deal didn't fix anything, because to do that really underemphasizes just how screwed we were during the Great Depression. FDR, long before World War II, managed to bring back enough stability and enough economic positive motion to get people hopeful again, to get people able to work again. What did he say? All we have to fear is fear itself. This is classic term. And he managed to defeat fear. He managed to, frankly, save capitalism. It is an interesting thing that, as I said, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the wealthiest people in America were the same rich people from the Gilded Age, essentially, or from the Roaring '20s. He didn't actually take any money away from any rich people.
Oh,
He
wow.
just made it harder to corruptly create.
To make silly amounts of money in silly ways.
Yeah, for a period of decades. And I think that that's probably something we should, it would be great. I think it's
Just
actually,
because you've brought in rules and safety standards to say F1 doesn't mean it's been banned. It still exists.
yeah, and I think it's entirely possible to continue to have a system where we create ridiculous amounts of wealth for individuals while also protecting and redistributing that wealth in a better way.
Well, just to bring it to like a medieval style, I remember just quite a lot of history tends to be you have a ruling elite, the peasants get annoyed with them and kill them, and then things are okay for a while, and then the cycle continues. So you could have that or bring in some
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's something that I emphasize over and over again is like we're at the consolidation, we're at the like rules period, and one of the amazing things about FDR is that he brought about a sense of renewal within the United States of economic leadership and refreshment, and didn't actually take any money away from wealthy people. Like, it's an extraordinary piece of success there that I think, say, Bernie Sanders of like 2016 or 2020, like could have actually, done something similar. And I think we're if we have another 4 years of a certain kind of Donald Trump, and then followed by, oh, I don't know, another 4 to 8 years of JD Vance or whatever, of a certain kind of JD Vance, the JD Vance that, not the JD Vance that talks about liking Lena Khan, but the JD Vance that just does the bidding of Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley.
Also, he has a sort of like, because he's like, well, I'm working class and I just went to university and became very successful. Why can't everyone? Like, he does seem to
Yeah.
have a slight like hatred of them.
Yeah. Well, if we get that, then I think we do get to what you're talking about, that classic feudal cycle of abuse, 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 and the peasants just sort of rise up and kill people. And then, we might actually have risk real revolution in the United States, which I think would be a really bad idea.
Oh yeah, be horrendous.
I'd rather we and I think to some extent we'll talk about in our next episode the potential of not revolution within the United States, but the potential of
World financial revolution.
world revolution against U.S. financial leadership as a potential economic catastrophe of the future that we'll be discussing. So hopefully you'll join us then.
So we'll catch you then. All the best.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.